The mansion stood tall, perched on the edge of Coronado's pristine coastline, its glass panels shimmering in the California sun. Rebecca Zahau stood on the balcony, gazing at the horizon. From afar, everything seemed perfect. The luxury of Jonah Shacknai's world, the whispers of waves below, and the supposed serenity of life in a multi-million-dollar estate. But inside, cracks were forming. Rebecca sipped her coffee, trying to shake off a lingering unease. Jonah's recent work commitments had kept him away for longer hours, and Rebecca often found herself alone with Max, his 6-year-old son. The boy was energetic, curious, and sometimes difficult to manage, but Rebecca adored him. She had spent the last few months doing her best to bond with Max, to prove to Jonah and maybe herself that she belonged here. A loud knock pulled her from her thoughts. She opened the door to find Adam Shacknai, Jonah's brother, standing there with an unreadable expression. Adam was always a presence that unsettled her. He had a way of speaking that felt invasive, as if he was trying to dig into her soul with his gaze. "Morning, Rebecca," he said, stepping in uninvited. "You okay? You look tense." Rebecca stiffened, brushing off his comment. "I'm fine, Adam. Just thinking." "Well," he drawled, leaning casually against the counter, "thinking can be dangerous, don't you think? Especially in a place like this." There was something ominous in his tone, but Rebecca chose to ignore it. Adam eventually left, but his words lingered, leaving a faint shadow in the air. Later that evening, Rebecca and Jonah sat down for dinner. Jonah's phone buzzed relentlessly, interrupting their meal. "Sorry," he muttered, glancing at the screen before placing it face down. He was distracted, distant. "How was your day with Max?" he asked, barely looking up. Rebecca hesitated. "He's great, but—" "Jonah, I've been feeling a little out of place here. She stopped herself, unwilling to let the vulnerability spill over. Jonah nodded but offered little comfort. "It's a lot to adjust to, I know," he said vaguely before returning to his phone. Rebecca forced a smile, masking the tension that had become her constant companion. She spent the rest of the evening alone, wandering through the house. The grandeur of the place often felt more like a cage than a home. Later, as she prepared for bed, her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen and froze. An unknown number had sent a message. "Not everything is as it seems." Her heart pounded. Who would send such a cryptic message? Was it meant for her? Was it a warning? She looked around the room, feeling a chill despite the warm summer air. For the first time since moving into the mansion, Rebecca felt truly unsafe. The walls that once symbolized wealth and comfort now seemed to close in on her, the whispers of secrets pressing against her ears. Rebecca tried to dismiss the unease as paranoia, but as she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, the words of the text lingered, echoing in her mind. She stared into the darkness, wondering what kind of illusion she had stepped into. The morning sun filtered through the large glass windows of the Coronado mansion, illuminating every corner of the grand living room. Rebecca stood at the kitchen counter, preparing breakfast. She glanced at Max, who was running around the living room with his boundless energy, clutching his favorite toy, a small scooter. "Max, slow down," Rebecca called out, her voice tinged with both affection and concern. "You're going to hurt yourself." Max didn't listen. His laughter echoed through the house, a momentary burst of innocence that seemed to push away the tension lingering in Rebecca's mind. She smiled briefly, reminded of how much she adored him, even as she struggled to navigate the complexities of her relationship with Jonah. But that fleeting calm shattered in an instant. A loud crash rang out from the living room, followed by an eerie silence. Rebecca froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She dropped the knife she was holding and sprinted toward the sound, dread coursing through her veins. "Max!" she shouted, her voice trembling as she approached the staircase. And then she saw it. Max lying motionless at the bottom of the grand staircase. The scooter lay overturned beside him, its wheels still spinning. Time seemed to stand still. Rebecca's knees buckled as she reached him. His small body was limp, his breathing shallow. A stream of blood trickled down his forehead, staining the marble floor. "Max, oh my God, Max!" Rebecca's voice cracked with panic as she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "Please hurry! A child has fallen. He's unconscious. I don't know if he's breathing properly." The operator's voice guided her through CPR instructions, but her hands shook uncontrollably. She pressed her ear to Max's chest, desperate to hear something, anything. His shallow breaths were faint, but there, relief and terror fought for dominance in her mind. Within minutes, the paramedics arrived, their urgency matching Rebecca's desperation. They worked quickly, assessing Max's injuries and stabilizing him before rushing him to the hospital. Rebecca stood frozen, watching them carry him out on a stretcher. Tears blurred her vision as the sound of the ambulance siren faded into the distance. The house felt impossibly quiet after they left. Rebecca sank onto the floor, her hands trembling as she replayed the moment over and over in her mind. What had gone wrong? Had she taken her eyes off him for too long? Guilt clawed at her chest, suffocating her. An hour later, Jonah burst through the front door, his face pale and etched with worry. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Rebecca stammered, He fell. I didn't see it happen. 1 second he was playing and then—" Jonah didn't wait for her to finish. He grabbed his keys and rushed to the hospital without another word, leaving Rebecca alone in the empty house. As the hours passed, Rebecca wandered the house in a daze. Her mind replayed Max's fall like a broken record, searching for answers. When she reached the staircase, something caught her eye, a faint scuff mark on the banister. It didn't look like something Max's scooter could have caused. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up. The screen displayed an unknown number, just like the message from the night before. The text read, "Accidents don't just happen. Watch your step." Rebecca's blood ran cold. She stared at the screen, her hands trembling. Was this a cruel coincidence? Or was someone trying to send her a message? As the day wore on, Jonah returned from the hospital with grim news. "Max is in critical condition," he said, his voice heavy with grief. "They're not sure if he's going to make it." Rebecca's knees gave way and she clutched the edge of the couch for support. "Jonah, I'm so sorry. I should have—" "Save it," Jonah snapped, his voice colder than she had ever heard it. "Just stay out of my way right now." The words cut deeper than she expected. Rebecca retreated to her room, her guilt now compounded by Jonah's anger. But as she lay awake that night, her mind kept circling back to the scuff mark, the text, and the sinking feeling that Max's fall wasn't just a tragic accident. Rebecca sat alone in the dimly lit living room of the sprawling mansion, her thoughts spiraling uncontrollably. Jonah had left for the hospital, his parting words echoing in her mind like a haunting refrain. "Stay out of my way." The weight of his anger pressed heavily on her chest, but it wasn't just his words that unsettled her. It was the silence that filled the house, punctuated only by the creak of the floorboards under her restless steps. She couldn't shake the image of the scuff mark on the staircase banister. It seemed so out of place, too deliberate to ignore. And then there was the text. "Accidents don't just happen. Watch your step." Someone was trying to reach her, taunt her, warn her. She couldn't be sure. As Rebecca turned the events of the day over in her mind, the front door opened abruptly. Adam Shacknai stepped inside, his presence filling the room with a tension she couldn't explain. He set down a small bag on the counter and gave her a curt nod. "How's Max?" Rebecca asked cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. Adam shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Still critical. Jonah's staying at the hospital for now." His gaze lingered on her a beat too long, and Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. There was a strange undercurrent in Adam's demeanor, something almost accusatory. "You know," he said, his tone casual but cutting, "you've had a rough day. Must be hard, knowing you were the only one here when it happened." Rebecca flinched, the implication hitting her like a slap. I don't know what you're trying to say, Adam," she stammered, trying to keep her composure. He smirked, leaning against the counter. "I'm not saying anything, just things happen, people talk." Rebecca's heart raced. It wasn't just the words. His tone carried an edge that made her stomach churn. "I did everything I could to help Max," she said, her voice firming. "It was an accident." "Sure," Adam replied, his smirk never faltering. "Accidents happen. But you might want to be careful. People love to point fingers when things go wrong." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Rebecca realized she was holding her breath. Adam finally walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, her fists clenched at her sides. The next day, Rebecca decided to revisit the staircase. She crouched near the banister, inspecting the scuff mark more closely. It was faint, but it looked fresh. She took a photo with her phone, hoping it might mean something later. But as she stood up, a voice startled her. "What are you doing?" Jonah's voice was sharp, his expression a mix of exhaustion and irritation. Rebecca spun around, her phone still in hand. "Jonah, Just what?" he snapped, his tone colder than she'd ever heard. "This isn't the time for games, Rebecca. My son is in the hospital fighting for his life." His words cut deep, and Rebecca felt her resolve crumble. "I'm trying to figure out what happened," she said quietly. "Something about all this doesn't feel right." Jonah shook his head, exasperated. "Not now. Please, just leave it alone." He walked away, leaving her standing there. Her photo and suspicions dismissed without a second thought. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Max's fall, something lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. That night, as she lay in bed, her phone buzzed again. She hesitated before picking it up, dread pooling in her stomach. Another message from the same unknown number. "You're in over your head. Leave while you still can." Rebecca's breath caught, her pulse quickening. Someone was watching her. Someone knew more than they were letting on. And for the first time since the accident, she began to wonder if she was in real danger. The night was unnervingly silent, broken only by the faint hum of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below the Coronado mansion. Rebecca sat curled on the edge of the living room couch, her phone gripped tightly in her hands. The message, "You're in over your head, leave while you still can," flashed on the screen, the words burning into her mind. Who could it be? Was this connected to Max's accident? Or worse, was someone inside the house watching her every move? Rebecca's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. She quickly turned off her phone and looked up to see Adam standing there, his shadow stretching across the room. His presence was both unexpected and deeply unsettling. "Can't sleep?" Adam asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Rebecca shook her head. "No, just a lot on my mind." Adam nodded, stepping closer. "Yeah, I get that. Tough few days, huh?" His tone was strangely casual, almost too nonchalant for the gravity of the situation. Rebecca forced a weak smile, hoping he would leave, but he lingered. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for something. "You know," he said after a long pause, "it's crazy how things can just fall apart so fast. One moment everything's fine, the next, chaos." Her stomach churned. "What are you trying to say, Adam?" "Nothing," he replied quickly, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Just an observation." Rebecca's unease deepened as Adam finally turned and walked away. She exhaled shakily, her grip on the phone tightening. The message felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. The next morning, Rebecca found herself unable to shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She wandered the house, her eyes scanning every corner for signs of anything unusual. When she reached the staircase, the faint scuff mark she had noticed before seemed more pronounced in the daylight. As she crouched to inspect it again, the front door opened, and a man's voice broke the silence. "Rebecca?" She turned quickly to see Jonah standing there, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Jonah," she said, her voice trembling. "How's Max?" "He's stable," Jonah replied, his tone clipped. "But it's still touch and go." Rebecca nodded, relief and guilt washing over her simultaneously. That's good to hear." Jonah's gaze shifted to the staircase. "What are you doing?" Rebecca hesitated, unsure how to explain. "I just noticed something. A mark on the banister. It doesn't look like it should be there." Jonah frowned, his exhaustion turning to irritation. "Rebecca, not everything needs an explanation. Max fell. It was an accident." "But stop," he snapped, cutting her off. "Please, just stop." Rebecca's heart sank as Jonah walked past her, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his grief. She felt tears prick her eyes, but quickly wiped them away. She couldn't let this go, not yet. Something wasn't adding up. Later that afternoon, Rebecca received another shock. A package had arrived for her, addressed in shaky handwriting. She opened it hesitantly, her pulse quickening. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words scrawled in red ink. "You know why." Her hands trembled as she dropped the note back into the box. Who was doing this, and why? She spent the rest of the day avoiding Jonah and Adam, retreating to her room with the note and her growing paranoia. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind replayed the events of the past few days, the accident, the text, the note. None of it made sense, but the pieces felt connected, as if part of a puzzle she couldn't yet see. Suddenly, a noise outside her window jolted her upright. She froze, her ears straining to hear. It sounded like footsteps crunching on gravel, moving slowly but deliberately. Rebecca crept toward the window, her heart pounding in her chest. Peering through the curtains, she caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving near the edge of the property. Before she could make out any details, the figure disappeared into the darkness. Rebecca stepped back from the window, her breathing shallow. She felt trapped, cornered by forces she didn't understand. But one thing was clear. Whatever was happening wasn't over, not by a long shot. Rebecca sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she clutched the piece of paper with the haunting words, "You know why." Her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Every corner of the mansion felt like it was watching her, every shadow a threat. She needed clarity, and there was only one person she trusted enough to call, her sister Mary. Grabbing her phone, Rebecca dialed the familiar number. The sound of Mary's voice on the other end brought a rush of comfort she hadn't felt in days. "Rebecca, are you okay?" Mary asked, concern evident in her tone. "No," Rebecca admitted, her voice cracking. "I don't even know where to start. Everything here is wrong." "What do you mean? Is it about Max?" Mary's question carried both sympathy and hesitation. Rebecca exhaled, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's more than that. Max's accident. These messages I've been getting. It's like someone's trying to scare me. Or worse." "Messages?" Mary's voice sharpened. "What kind of messages?" Rebecca hesitated before reading the latest one aloud. "And it's not just this. Someone left a note in a package for me today. You know why." "Mary, I don't understand what's happening, but it feels intentional." Mary paused, her breathing audible through the phone. "Rebecca, you need to get out of there. Whatever's going on, it's not safe." "I can't," Rebecca replied, her voice barely audible. "Jonah's already furious with me, and Max is still in critical condition. Leaving now would look—" She trailed off, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "Listen to me," Mary said firmly. "If you feel unsafe, you need to go. Don't wait for something worse to happen." Rebecca closed her eyes, her sister's words striking a chord deep within her. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But Mary, if something happens to me—" "Don't say that," Mary interrupted, panic creeping into her voice. "No, listen." Rebecca's voice wavered. "If something happens to me, promise me you won't let it go. Promise me you'll fight to find out the truth." "Rebecca, nothing's going to happen to you," Mary said, her voice shaking. "But I promise, no matter what." The call ended, leaving Rebecca sitting in silence. She felt a glimmer of reassurance in her sister's words, but the unease in her chest refused to fade. As she placed the phone down, a soft knock on her door startled her. She froze, her pulse quickening. "Rebecca?" It was Adam's voice, low and almost deliberate. She didn't answer immediately, unsure whether to trust her instincts or her fear. "What is it?" she finally called out. The door opened slightly, Adam's face appearing in the crack. "Just wanted to check on you. You seemed tense earlier." "I'm fine," Rebecca replied quickly, her tone sharper than she intended. Adam stepped inside, ignoring her obvious discomfort. "You sure? You've been acting a little jumpy." "I said I'm fine," Rebecca repeated, her eyes narrowing. Adam smirked, holding up his hands in mock surrender. All right, just trying to be helpful." He lingered for a moment longer before backing out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. Rebecca let out a shaky breath, her heart pounding. Something about Adam's demeanor unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. She locked the door, her mind racing. The note, the messages, the shadows in the mansion, it all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle, one she was terrified to solve. Later that night, as the house fell into silence, Rebecca stared at the ceiling, her thoughts drifting back to her conversation with Mary. Her sister's words echoed in her mind. "You need to get out of there." But where would she go? And what would she be running from? Sleep came fitfully, haunted by fragmented images of shadows and whispers. But one thing remained clear in Rebecca's mind. If she didn't find out the truth soon, it might be too late. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Adam Shacknai stepped out of the guest house, the air thick with an eerie stillness. He rubbed his eyes and walked toward the main house, his footsteps crunching softly against the gravel. Something felt off, too quiet, even for a house that had seen so much grief in the past few days. As Adam approached the patio, his eyes caught an unnatural flash of red swaying in the gentle morning breeze. He stopped, squinting, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Then the realization hit him like a freight train. "Jesus Christ!" he exclaimed, stumbling backward. Rebecca Zahau's lifeless body hung from the second-floor balcony. She was bound, her wrists tied behind her back, her ankles secured together. The red rope around her neck stretched taut, suspending her eerily still form. Her dark hair obscured part of her face, and she was completely unclothed, her vulnerability on stark display in the morning light. Panic surged through Adam as he sprinted inside the house, fumbling for his phone. He dialed 911 with trembling hands, his voice a mix of shock and urgency as he spoke to the operator. "There's a woman. She's hanging. She's dead. She's hanging off the balcony." The operator's calm voice attempted to guide him, but Adam's words were frantic and fragmented. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and rushed back outside. "I'm cutting her down!" he yelled into the phone, his hands shaking as he sawed through the rope. Rebecca's body fell limply onto the cold tiles below. Adam's breathing was ragged as he crouched beside her, his mind racing. Her eyes were closed, her lips slightly parted, but there was no sign of life. The operator's voice urged him to check for a pulse, but his shaking hands found none. Minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance, the sound growing louder as emergency vehicles arrived at the mansion. Paramedics and police officers poured into the scene, their faces a mixture of professionalism and unease as they surveyed the gruesome sight. Detective Lisa Fowler, the lead investigator, arrived moments later. Her sharp eyes took in the scene, the balcony, the rope, Rebecca's lifeless body now lying on the patio. She turned to Adam, who was pacing nervously nearby. "You were the one who found her?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. Adam nodded, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Yeah, I came out this morning and she was just hanging there. I cut her down. I thought maybe she wasn't gone yet." Lisa's gaze didn't waver. "Did you touch anything else? Move anything?" "No," Adam stammered. "Just the rope, I swear." As the paramedics declared Rebecca dead at the scene, Lisa turned her attention to the immediate surroundings. Her eyes landed on the open balcony door above and then on the wall near the patio. Written in black paint were chilling words. "She saved him. Can you save her?" The cryptic message sent a ripple of unease through the officers on site. Lisa approached it cautiously, her mind already racing with questions. Who had written it, and what did it mean? Inside the house, Jonah Shacknai arrived shortly after, his face ashen as he took in the scene. His voice cracked as he demanded answers. "What happened? What's going on?" Detective Fowler turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Shacknai, I'm sorry for your loss. We're investigating this as thoroughly as possible, but at this point it appears to be a suicide." "A suicide?" Jonah's voice rose in disbelief. "Rebecca wouldn't... She couldn't have done this." Lisa hesitated, noting the raw emotion in his voice. "We'll examine every angle, but we need your cooperation and patience." As the morning unfolded, evidence was collected, photographs were taken, and questions loomed larger. Rebecca's death was ruled a suicide almost immediately, but whispers of doubt spread quickly. The bindings, the message, the method, it all felt too deliberate, too staged. And though the mansion was now filled with investigators, one thing was clear. The truth was still shrouded in shadows. The morning sun cast a harsh light on the Coronado mansion, but the air inside was anything but clear. Rebecca's death, labeled a suicide by the initial police report, left the Shacknai family reeling, but it also raised questions that no one could ignore. Detective Lisa Fowler sat in her car outside the property, reviewing her notes. The scene from earlier played over in her mind like a looping reel, the bindings on Rebecca's wrists and ankles, the cryptic message painted on the wall, and Adam Shacknai's nervous pacing. Something wasn't right. The pieces didn't fit, no matter how hard she tried to force them into place. Inside the house, Jonah Shacknai stood near the kitchen counter, his knuckles white as he gripped a cup of coffee. Adam hovered nearby, his demeanor unusually subdued. "They're saying it was suicide," Adam said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. Jonah's gaze snapped to his brother. "Rebecca wouldn't do that," he said sharply. "You know her. She loved life. She loved Max." Adam hesitated, his eyes darting away. "I mean, people snap under pressure, Jonah, with everything going on. Max's accident, the guilt. Maybe she just couldn't take it anymore." Jonah slammed the cup down, coffee sloshing over the rim. "Don't you dare say that. Rebecca was stronger than that. If you're so sure it was suicide, then explain the bindings, explain the message on the wall." His voice cracked, the weight of his grief breaking through his usual composure. Before Adam could respond, the doorbell rang, its chime piercing through the tense atmosphere. Detective Fowler entered the room moments later, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Mr. Shacknai," she said, addressing Jonah directly, "I'd like to go over a few things about the investigation." Jonah gestured for her to sit, but his frustration was palpable. "Detective, I've already told your officers. Rebecca wouldn't do this." Fowler nodded, her expression neutral. "I understand your concerns, but as of now, there's no evidence pointing to foul play. That being said, some aspects of the scene are unusual." Jonah leaned forward, his voice low but firm. Unusual doesn't even begin to cover it. Have you seen the knots on her wrists, the way she was tied up? How does someone do that to themselves? Fowler didn't answer immediately, her pen tapping against her notebook. That's one of the questions we're looking into, she said finally. But we need your cooperation. Did Rebecca show any signs of distress recently? Anything out of the ordinary? Jonah hesitated, his mind flashing back to the days leading up to her death. Rebecca had seemed more withdrawn, but she hadn't spoken openly about her feelings. Then there was the tension after Max's accident, her guilt, his coldness. Had he pushed her too far? No, Jonah said finally. Nothing that would suggest this. Adam, who had been silent until now, interjected. What about those messages she was getting? Fowler's head snapped up. Messages? What kind of messages? Jonah turned to Adam, confusion and suspicion flickering across his face. What are you talking about? Adam shifted uncomfortably. She mentioned something about getting weird texts. I didn't think much of it at the time. Fowler's pen froze midair. Texts? Do you have any of these messages, Mr. Shacknai? Jonah shook his head, still staring at Adam. She didn't tell me anything about this. Fowler's gaze sharpened. We'll need access to her phone records. The tension in the room thickened as Adam's posture stiffened. She might have been paranoid, he said, his voice defensive. You know how stress can mess with people's heads. Fowler didn't respond, but her eyes lingered on Adam a moment too long before she stood. We'll be in touch, she said, her tone professional but edged with suspicion. As she left the house, Fowler couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was being hidden from her, something critical. Her gut told her to dig deeper, and she intended to follow it. Back inside, Jonah rounded on Adam. Why didn't you tell me about the texts? Adam raised his hands. I didn't think it was important. She didn't seem that bothered. Jonah's glare darkened. If there's something you're not telling me, Adam, now's the time. Adam didn't answer, but the flicker of unease in his eyes spoke volumes. Whatever he was hiding, it was becoming harder to conceal. Mary Zahau sat at her kitchen table, the newspaper spread before her. The headline was bold and accusatory. Rebecca Zahau's death ruled suicide. Mystery deepens. The words made her blood boil. Every fiber of her being rejected the idea that her sister had taken her own life. Rebecca was strong, resilient. This was not the way her story was supposed to end. She picked up her phone and dialed the lawyer's number. Mr. Greer, she began, her voice steady but laced with determination. I want justice for Rebecca, whatever it takes. Mary wasn't alone in her resolve. The entire Zahau family had banded together, pooling resources and reaching out to anyone who could help uncover the truth. Their first step was hiring an independent forensic expert to re-examine the evidence they believed had been dismissed too quickly. In a sterile lab, Dr. Jennifer Monroe, a seasoned forensic pathologist, reviewed the case files and photographs. The bindings on Rebecca's wrists and ankles caught her attention immediately. These knots are highly complex, she remarked to Mary and their lawyer. It's almost impossible for someone to tie themselves like this. Mary's heart raced. So you're saying she couldn't have done this to herself? Dr. Monroe nodded. It strongly suggests the involvement of another person. And there's more. The bruising patterns on her neck and back. They're inconsistent with a simple hanging. These injuries point to a struggle. The findings were a glimmer of hope, but they were just the beginning. Armed with this new information, the Zahau family pressed the police to reopen the investigation. However, their requests were met with resistance. The case is closed, Detective Fowler stated flatly during a tense meeting. We found no evidence of foul play. Mary refused to back down. Then you didn't look hard enough, she shot back, her voice unwavering. Meanwhile, whispers about Adam Shacknai's potential involvement began to spread. A private investigator hired by the Zahau family uncovered a piece of chilling information. A small trace of red paint matching the writing on the wall was found on Adam's fingernail during the initial investigation. Why hadn't this been pursued further? The family also uncovered a series of financial transactions from Jonah Shacknai's accounts, large sums transferred to an unknown recipient in the weeks leading up to Rebecca's death. The timing seemed too coincidental, too suspicious. As the days turned into weeks, the Zahau family's relentless pursuit of justice began to gain traction. Media outlets picked up the story, and public opinion started to shift. A prominent news anchor posed the question that had been haunting Mary. If this was truly a suicide, why are there so many unanswered questions? Mary appeared on a national talk show, her voice trembling but resolute. Rebecca was kind, full of life. She didn't deserve this, and she didn't do this to herself. We need the truth. for her and for everyone who's been denied justice. The interview struck a chord with viewers. Social media buzzed with theories and debates, with hashtags like #JusticeForRebecca trending nationwide. The pressure on law enforcement to revisit the case became impossible to ignore. But behind the scenes, the Zahau family's efforts drew ire from the Shacknai family. Jonah issued a public statement urging people to respect the conclusions of the investigation. "This has been a tragedy for all involved," he said. "It's time to let Rebecca rest in peace." Mary wasn't swayed. "Rebecca can't rest," she told a reporter, "until the truth comes out." The mounting tension culminated in a legal breakthrough. The Zahau family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Adam Shacknai, accusing him of playing a role in Rebecca's death. The case was set to go to trial, promising to shed light on the dark mysteries surrounding that fateful morning. As Mary prepared for the battle ahead, she clung to one thought. Justice wasn't just a goal. It was a promise she had made to her sister, and she would not stop until it was fulfilled. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Mary Zahau walked in, her head held high despite the weight of grief and determination pressing on her shoulders. The trial against Adam Shacknai had drawn national attention, filling the room with reporters, spectators, and a sea of watchful eyes. This was more than just a wrongful death lawsuit. It was a public reckoning. Adam sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his legal team. His expression was stoic, but Mary noticed his hands fidgeting, a subtle sign of unease. Across the room, Jonah Shacknai's presence was equally commanding. Though not a defendant, his silent loyalty to his brother cast a long shadow over the proceedings. "Order in the court," the judge announced, bringing the room to silence. The Zahau family's attorney, Keith Greer, opened the case with precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady, "this case is about accountability. Rebecca Zahau was a vibrant, compassionate woman whose life was stolen under suspicious circumstances. We're here to prove that her death was not a suicide, but a deliberate act." The first day of testimony focused on forensic evidence. Dr. Jennifer Monroe, the independent pathologist hired by the Zahau family, took the stand. Her demeanor was calm but commanding as she walked the jury through the details. "The bindings on Ms. Zahau's wrists and ankles are complex," she explained, pointing to enlarged photographs. "They are consistent with restraint, not self-infliction. Furthermore, the bruising patterns on her body suggest a struggle, an indicator of foul play." Adam's defense team was quick to counter. "Doctor," the lead defense attorney said, pacing in front of the jury, "isn't it true that the bruising could also be consistent with someone trying to free themselves?" Dr. Monroe remained composed. "It's possible," she replied, "but the overall evidence points more strongly to external involvement." The trial took a dramatic turn when Mary Zahau herself took the stand. Her voice trembled at first, but she steadied herself, channeling the strength Rebecca had always admired in her. "Rebecca was a fighter," she told the jury. "She would never have done this to herself. If you knew her, you'd know that." "Mrs. Zahau," the defense lawyer interjected, "do you have any concrete evidence to support your claims, or is this just speculation driven by grief?" Mary's gaze didn't waver. "The evidence is there. You just don't want to see it." The room murmured, the tension palpable. Perhaps the most shocking moment of the trial came when Keith Greer introduced a piece of previously overlooked evidence, a fingerprint smudged in red paint near the message on the wall. "This fingerprint," he declared, holding up a photograph, "matches Adam Shacknai's left hand." The courtroom erupted in gasps. Adam's face flushed as he leaned toward his attorney, whispering furiously. The judge pounded her gavel, demanding order. Adam was called to the stand, his demeanor visibly shaken. Under questioning, he struggled to explain the fingerprint. I touched the wall earlier," he stammered. It was nothing. I didn't write anything." "Then why is the paint consistent with the message found near Rebecca's body?" Greer pressed, his voice cutting through the room. "I don't know," Adam snapped, his frustration evident. The jury listened intently, their faces betraying a mixture of doubt and suspicion. For every defense Adam's lawyers mounted, the Zahau family countered with questions that cast shadows over his innocence. Outside the courtroom, media frenzy reached a fever pitch. Reporters hounded Mary for statements, while social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForRebecca and #TruthAboutAdam. Public opinion was turning sharply against the Shacknai family, adding pressure to an already volatile trial. As the proceedings neared their conclusion, Keith Greer addressed the jury one final time. "This isn't just about Rebecca Zahau. he said, his voice heavy with emotion. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful or connected, is above the law. The jury was left to deliberate, the weight of justice resting squarely on their shoulders. But for Mary, the trial was more than a verdict. It was a promise to her sister, one she was determined to keep. The courtroom was silent as the prosecution's final witness approached the stand. A man in his late 40s, dressed in a sharp gray suit, he exuded an air of authority. He was the private investigator hired by the Zahau family, and his testimony was set to expose a side of the case that had been hidden until now. "Mr. Carter," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court about the financial transactions you uncovered in the weeks leading up to Rebecca Zahau's death?" Carter adjusted his glasses and leaned toward the microphone. "Yes, my investigation revealed several large transfers from Jonah Shacknai's personal accounts to an anonymous recipient. The amounts were unusual, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the timing coincided with the days leading up to and immediately after Rebecca's death." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Jonah shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expression tightening. "Do we know who received these payments?" the prosecutor asked. "We traced the transactions to a private account registered to Adam Shacknai," Carter replied, his voice steady. The room erupted in gasps, and Adam visibly stiffened at the defendant's table. His attorney stood quickly. "Objection! This testimony is speculative and irrelevant." The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Overruled. Continue." The prosecutor pressed on. "Mr. Carter, did you find any evidence to suggest what these payments were for?" Carter nodded. "While the exact purpose of the payments remains unclear, there were notes attached to the transactions, phrases like urgent, final arrangement, and discretion." Mary Zahau, sitting behind the prosecution's table, gripped the edge of her seat. She exchanged a glance with her attorney, their unspoken understanding solidifying. This was more than just a coincidence. The prosecution then shifted focus to another piece of evidence, the fingerprint smudge found in red paint near the message on the wall. It had been analyzed further since the trial began, and the results were damning. "Dr. Monroe," the prosecutor said, recalling the forensic pathologist to the stand, "can you explain the significance of this fingerprint?" Dr. Monroe held up a diagram of the fingerprint and its placement on the wall. "This print matches Adam Shacknai's left thumb. Its location near the painted message strongly suggests he was present during or after the message was written." Adam's attorney objected again, but the damage had been done. The jury's faces were a mixture of shock and disbelief. The defense scrambled to regain control, calling Adam to the stand in a desperate attempt to explain away the evidence. Adam appeared tense as he adjusted his tie, his voice wavering under the weight of scrutiny. "I didn't write that message," he insisted, his hands gripping the edges of the witness box. "Yes, I touched the wall, but it wasn't like that. I was just trying to help." The prosecutor leaned forward. "Help? By leaving fingerprints in red paint next to a woman who was bound and hanging? You expect this court to believe that?" Adam's face flushed. "I don't know how the paint got there," he snapped, his frustration boiling over. "It's a mistake, all right? I didn't hurt Rebecca." His outburst sent ripples through the courtroom. Jonah buried his face in his hands while Mary sat stone-faced, her resolve unshaken. The trial continued late into the evening, but the cracks in Adam's story widened with every passing hour. The Zahau family's determination to uncover the truth had brought them to this pivotal moment, and the weight of their evidence was becoming undeniable. As the court adjourned for the day, Mary stood outside the building, the cool evening air wrapping around her like a shield. She stared at the growing crowd of reporters and cameras, her thoughts focused on one thing: justice for Rebecca, for the life stolen from her too soon. Adam exited the courthouse surrounded by his legal team, his expression a mix of anger and fear. As he passed Mary, their eyes met briefly, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something she hadn't expected: guilt. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And it gave her hope that the lies that had buried Rebecca's truth were finally beginning to unravel. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the day of the verdict. The air buzzed with anticipation, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Journalists whispered among themselves, cameras poised to capture the reactions of the key players in this high-profile trial. At the front of the room, Mary Zahau sat with her hands tightly clasped, her knuckles white against the deep mahogany of the bench. This was the moment they had been fighting for. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Each step they took seemed to echo louder than the last. As they took their seats, the judge called the room to order, her gavel striking with a resounding authority that silenced the murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the judge began, her voice steady, "have you reached a verdict?" The jury foreperson, a woman with a calm but resolute demeanor, rose. "We have, Your Honor." Mary's heart pounded in her chest as she leaned forward, her breath caught in her throat. Adam Shacknai, seated at the defendant's table, appeared calm on the surface, but his clenched jaw and rigid posture betrayed his inner turmoil. The foreperson unfolded a piece of paper and began to read. "In the matter of the wrongful death of Rebecca Zahau, we find the defendant, Adam Shacknai." She paused, the weight of her next words hanging in the air. "Liable." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Mary's eyes filled with tears as she clutched Keith Greer's arm. Relief, vindication, and sorrow surged through her all at once. She had promised Rebecca she would fight for the truth, and now a part of that promise had been fulfilled. The judge struck her gavel again, calling for silence. "The court acknowledges the jury's decision. Damages will be discussed in a subsequent hearing. This session is adjourned." Adam's expression was a mixture of shock and anger. He turned to his attorney, whispering furiously, but it was clear that the verdict had shaken him. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and stormed out of the courtroom, avoiding the flashing cameras outside. Jonah Shacknai, who had remained mostly silent throughout the trial, rose from his seat slowly. His face was pale, his eyes heavy with a mix of disbelief and resignation. He approached Mary, standing just a few feet from her. For a moment it seemed like he might say something, but he simply nodded once and left, his steps heavy and deliberate. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters clamored for statements. Mary stepped forward, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. "Today's verdict is a step toward justice," she said, her words resonating with conviction. "But let me be clear, this is not the end. We will continue to fight until Rebecca's name is cleared and the full truth is revealed." The media frenzy intensified as Mary's words echoed across television screens and social media platforms. The hashtags #justice for Rebecca and #truth prevails began trending once again, reigniting public discourse about the case and the unanswered questions surrounding it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mary stood on the courthouse steps, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. She knew that while the verdict was a victory, it wasn't the closure she had hoped for. The Shacknai family's influence loomed large, and Rebecca's story was far from over. Keith Greer joined her, his voice low. "You did it, Mary. This is a big win." Mary nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not about winning," she said quietly. "It's about the truth. And until everyone knows what really happened to Rebecca, I'm not stopping." As the courthouse emptied and the crowd dispersed, the Zahau family left with their heads held high. Rebecca's voice, silenced too soon, had been heard through the trial, and her story was now a part of the fight for justice, a fight that would not end until the shadows surrounding her death were banished by the light of truth. The wind rustled gently through the tall palms outside the Zahau family home, carrying with it the bittersweet echoes of the trial's conclusion. Inside, Mary sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by photographs of Rebecca, moments frozen in time that felt worlds away from the harsh reality of her sister's death. The verdict had brought validation, but it hadn't brought closure. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Keith Greer, his usual composed demeanor now tinged with a heaviness that Mary hadn't seen before. He held a stack of documents, the weight of their contents evident in his expression. "Mary," he began gently, "there's something we need to discuss." She gestured for him to sit, bracing herself. "What is it?" Keith placed the documents on the table. "The wrongful death verdict was a victory, but it doesn't address the root issue. Without criminal charges, the public narrative will always leave room for doubt. Adam Shacknai is still a free man, and Jonah's influence complicates things further." Mary's jaw tightened. "So, what do we do now?" Keith hesitated before responding. "We keep fighting. We push for the case to be reopened, but it's going to take more than just legal maneuvers. Public pressure is key." Mary nodded, determination flaring in her eyes. "Then we take it to the court of public opinion. If the system won't listen, we'll make sure the world does." In the weeks that followed, the Zahau family launched a campaign to reignite interest in Rebecca's case. They partnered with advocacy groups and organized rallies, demanding that the local authorities reconsider the evidence. The haunting details of Rebecca's death, the bindings, the message on the wall, the suspicious financial transactions, were once again thrust into the spotlight. News outlets revisited the case with renewed vigor. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative reports dissected every aspect of Rebecca's final days, uncovering inconsistencies that even the trial hadn't addressed. The public response was overwhelming. Social media erupted with calls for justice, and protests outside the Coronado Police Department grew louder by the day. But the resistance from law enforcement and the Shacknai family was equally fierce. Jonah issued a public statement dismissing the Zahau family's efforts as a misguided vendetta. Adam remained out of sight, his legal team maintaining his innocence. The police stood by their original conclusion, citing a lack of new evidence. Despite the obstacles, Mary refused to back down. Late one night, as she reviewed old photos and case files, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from a journalist who had been quietly investigating the case. "I found something," the text read. "A former employee of Jonah Shacknai is willing to talk. He claims to have information about what really happened the night Rebecca died." Mary's heart raced as she read the words. Could this be the break they had been waiting for? The journalist provided the contact information, and Mary wasted no time setting up a meeting. The following day, she sat across from the whistleblower in a quiet cafe. He was nervous, glancing over his shoulder as he spoke in hushed tones. "I worked for Jonah for years," he began. "There were things I saw, things I wasn't supposed to talk about. But Rebecca's death, it wasn't what they're saying it was." Mary leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What do you know?" The man hesitated, his hands trembling as he sipped his coffee. "I know that Adam wasn't acting alone. Jonah. He knew more than he's letting on." The revelation hit Mary like a lightning bolt. If Jonah had been involved in covering up the truth, it explained the financial transactions, the resistance from law enforcement, and the carefully crafted public statements. As the man continued to speak, Mary realized that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The fight for justice wasn't over, it was only just beginning. Armed with this new information, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Rebecca's voice had been silenced, but her story would not be buried. Mary stood up from the table, her resolve solidified. The battle for truth was far from finished, but Mary knew one thing for certain. She would see it through to the very end. What do you think of Rebecca Zahau and the mystery surrounding her case? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below and rate this story from 0 to 10. How shocking was it for you? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories.